Now I'm sat on the remnants of the anti-tank wall at Utah Beach. You might wonder why I'm on Utah Beach for a film about code talkers. You've probably seen the film WIndtalkers starring Nicolas Cage. It was about Navajo Nation signalsmen using Navajo language in the Pacific that the Japanese couldn't understand. Now, the first use of code talkers was in the First World War. The Germans had broken the American code, and so Choctaw Indians were used to send messages in their own language that the Germans couldn't understand and other Indians couldn't understand either. Now, an unbreakable code was devised shortly before the war ended. In the Second World War, the Japanese had a code that the Americans called Purple. They managed to break it, and getting information from this code was called magic. But breaking this code is more useful in Europe than in the Pacific, because the Japanese ambassador in Germany, he would send lots of messages about information on the Atlantic Wall. So that's how the Allies got a lot of information on the Atlantic Wall from the Japanese ambassador in Germany. Their communications during the Second World War became highly complex and involved sophisticated mathematic systems of coding and decoding, frequent code changing. Breaking the Enigma code involved thousands of people at Bletchley Park. Most codes are based on the user's language, which is known to the enemy, who can use that knowledge to help break it. Using a hidden language, unknown to the enemy, can be a code in itself. In the First World War, Choctaw Indians had been used to send messages. The Germans were aware that had been done during World War I and had been studying the problem. That's why code talkers were used more extensively in the Pacific than in Europe. Using a code like the Enigma machine entails the operator typing each letter, then writing down the code that lit up. Then the coded message would be sent by Morse. The recipient would go through the same process to get the deciphered message. The code talker method was much more rapid. The sender would read the message from English into their tribal language. The recipient would write it down in English. Native servicemen joined the armed forces for a complex combination of reasons. One was traditional cultural motivations, warrior-based themes. 2, influences of attending boarding school. 3, unemployment, like many men. 4, a patriotic ideology regarding the defense of their own lands and peoples, and now the United States, of which they were a part. It's not known exactly how many native Indians enlisted or were drafted. It might be around 25,000 to 40,000. Some individuals enlisted as Anglos without claiming Indian heritage. There were 2 types of code talkers: those that used their language plus special code words for special items, and those that just used their native language. The film WIndtalkers is about using Navajo code talkers with the Marines. Being Hollywood, the film concentrates more on the Nicolas Cage character, who was there to protect them, than the actual code talkers. Joe Price, who was one of those Navajo code talkers, he saw action with Marine Headquarters Battalion. He also fought in Okinawa and Nagasaki. He saw the film and commented, "I would say 75% is what happened and 25% is fictionalized." In 1942, the Navajo tribal population numbered over 25,000, with over 11,600 men. Some 420 code talkers were recruited for use in the Marine Corps. Navajo was thought to be the hardest language to learn. Of the several tribes used as code talkers, only the Navajo, Comanche, and Hopi used special code words on top of their language. In 1940, 17 Oneida and Chippewa joined the 32nd Infantry Division for training to adapt their language. They used effectively during war games in Louisiana. The Army Signals Corps then recruited Comanches from Oklahoma. The irony was that the Indians had been forbidden to use their native language and now were being asked to use it. The candidates had to be fluent in English and their native language. Bill Carty, who was a Comanche, recruited several code talkers while they were on Christmas leave in 1941. Charles Chibity joined up because his cousin Larry Sorpity went. The Comanches had an advantage over the Navajo in that they were often sent to boarding school and had more contact with Anglo-Americans. At the enlistment visit, Codina, Chibity and Red Elk were being weighed. You had to be at least 122 pounds, that is 55 kilograms. Chibity and Codina were over the limit, but Red Elk was under the limit. The others said wouldn't go unless Red Elk went. The sergeant probably didn't know how they were going to be used. He said Red Elk couldn't go. He gave them 24 hours to get his weight up. He ate loads of bananas and water. The next day was still only 115 pounds. Red Elk was going to be refused. Just then a lieutenant came along who knew where they were going. He suggested Red Elk was weighed again, as it might have been a mistake. With the lieutenant's foot helping, the weight was now 118 pounds. Red Elk was in. In the first training, they were taught to march. The sergeant expected a shambles, but they followed the instructions perfectly. He said, "You guys aren't supposed to know all this." Most of them had been to boarding school, where they had marching drills. It was the same for making up tight beds and on the firing range. After basic training, they started on signals training. They had to know how to set up wires and telegraph, repair radios, and use Morse. In August 41, their special code talker training started. On August 1st, there was a mock battle in Louisiana swamps. 2 code talkers were captured. They were speaking together in Comanche. One said, "The guard's going to smoke soon. When he does, I'll kick him in the legs and you jump on him." The plan worked. Standing over the guard, they said, "We'll have to kill you now." Pointing a finger, he said, "Pow!" and they ran off. The code talking training was carried out by Lieutenant Foster at Fort Benning. They had to devise special words for key items that couldn't be understood even by other Comanches. There were no words in Comanche for such things as bombers, machine guns, divisions, and many other terms. It was left up to the men to devise words. 250 special words were invented by 17 Comanche code talkers. Lieutenant Foster gave them a list of terms, and they would have a think tank. One might propose a Comanche word, and someone else a different word. When they agreed on the word for the term, Lieutenant Foster would write it down in his phonetic method. Comanche had a word for gun, but not the many different types. They decided that machine gun sounded like a sewing machine, so it became a sewing machine gun. Tatsakuna Tawai was a 30 caliber. A 50 caliber was a big sewing machine gun. Pia Tatsukana Tawai. Wahatu Mo Avatu Piato Woi was a 55 big gun, or a 55 caliber howitzer. Wakaraye, a turtle, was a tank. Utsu no Avgaatu, a pregnant bird, was a bomber. And bombs were baby birds. They devised a protocol to get in touch with the required person. Cactus 6 was a division commanding general. Cabbage 6 was the 8th Infantry Regiment commander. So Cactus, Cabbage, Red, Able meant 4th Division, 8th Regiment, 1st Battalion, A Company. After getting into the correct person, he'd say, "Give me a code talker." He would then read the message in Comanche. Some names are spelt out in Comanche words, and the first letter of the English word would spell out the term. Disbe wala je tiking bi sodi bi lasana neshchi would translate to sheep, ant, ice, pig, apple, and nut. So the first letters spelt Saipan. The use of Navajo code talkers was kept secret, but the 4th Division, which used the Comanches, published an article on their actions. There were few Comanche code talkers, so if the Germans knew about them, it wouldn't be feasible for them to invest the time and resources to learn the code. Even if they captured a Comanche soldier, he wouldn't be able to understand the code. One day on an exercise in the woods near Fort Benning, the sergeant left the group for a short while. One started singing a song over the radio. Some others started dancing. The sergeant came back, but stayed behind a tree watching them. When he showed himself, they stopped, but he started asking questions about the dancing. A few days later, he asked them if they danced for an audience. They agreed. So Charles Shiberty and Simon Parker sent home for their war dance costumes. They needed a drum, so a 2.5-ton truck was sent to pick up hides to make drums. The performance was a success, and they were soon inundated with requests to dance. They performed in Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. The 4th Division was based at Fort Benning, but went to Fort Jackson in October 41. They returned to Fort Benning on December the 3rd, just before Pearl Harbor. When the division moved for training, the signalsmen would arrive earlier to set up the communications and leave the training area later, as they had to recover miles of cables. Lieutenant Foster had been training them from the start. In February 42, he was promoted and transferred to Harvard. He never saw the Comanches again till after the war. In September 43, they were at Camp Gordon Johnson in Florida for amphibious training from landing-craft onto beaches. 17 had started the training. When they moved to New Jersey to go to England, 3 were discharged to Fort Dix, leaving just 14 code talkers. The 4th Division left from Hoboken in a large convoy. The 4th Single Company was in the George Washington. Roderick Red Elk remembers that they were seasick. The convoy zigzagged and took several days to cross the Atlantic. They arrived at Liverpool on the 29th of January. From Liverpool, they were taken by train to Tiverton in Devon. They took part in the infamous Operation Tiger, which was a rehearsal for D-Day. The ships carrying the 4th Division sailed in a wide curve as if crossing the Channel and were to attack Slapton Sands in Lyme Bay. Some German E-boats happened to come along and sank some ships. 948 men died. The signalsmen were lucky. Morris Sunrise was transferred to the 1st Corps, leaving just 13 code talkers. Although they trained as a group, they were now spread around the division, between the 3 regiments, the artillery and Division HQ. The 4th Division consisted of the 8th, 12th and the 22nd regiments. The code talkers were normally assigned to a regiment and would communicate with division, sometimes down to battalion level. And more rarely, a company would have a code talker in the front line. At regimental headquarters, there were several. They could be called to take messages when needed. Just after the landings, all code talkers were not far from each other. As the front extended, as the Allies moved across Europe, they would be spread out, and a pair of code talkers might not see the others for weeks. Most communications were by wire. The signal men would lay wires from a truck with a big reel on the back. The wire would be attached to a tree periodically. Wires would often be laid alongside German lines. The wires would be marked to identify them with coloured tags. If a truck couldn't advance due to terrain or shelling, 2 men would take a smaller reel on a pipe handle. A truck reel had a mile of wire, a hand reel had half a mile. Forrest Casanavoid recalled laying wire in France. They came to a railroad and were trying to decide whether to go under over the track. A local told them that no trains had gone along the track since the Germans arrived. Just an hour later, some American soldiers had found a manually propelled cart and the wires were cut. Cassandavoid had to find the break and splice it in the dark. Most communications went through wire, but radio was used as well. Most commanders preferred wire, it was more direct. For radio communications, one had to go through a radio operator and use required terms. Radio could easily be intercepted by the enemy, but wire wasn't immune from being tapped into. There were two general types of messages sent by the code talkers, offensive and defensive. Defensive messages consisted primarily of reports of contacts with opposing forces and their strengths and positions. Offensive messages generally focused on orders for movements, missions, resupply, and reports on one's own troop, equipment, and status. Many messages were sent in plain English. When secrecy was needed, the usual coding protocol would need 6 steps from writing, coding, sending, receiving, decoding, and delivery. Using the code talkers was much more rapid. The code talker would translate the message mentally into Comanche, transmit it, and the receiver would instantly translate it back into English. Defensive or offensive messages could be coded. Near the Siegfried line, Forrest Cassandavoid reported that the Germans were so low in fuel that they were using horse-drawn vehicles. They didn't want the Germans to know that they knew, so the message was coded. Messages were usually no longer than 3 lines. A longer message might allow the Germans to pinpoint their position and start shelling them. The code talker receiving the message would often finish with Utekawapa Naka, I hear what you say. The signal men had highly classified Signal Operations Instructions, SOI. This would include the frequencies for radio communications with different units. These would be changed daily. There was also the protocol to authenticate each other's identity. A small unit like a company would only have one radio, so the operator had to change the frequencies depending on who he wanted to contact. Code talkers would often be the only one in the unit. Sometimes there were 2. They would be kept separate to reduce the risk of both of them being killed by a shell. Most of the code talkers' time was spent in troubleshooting or looking for breaks in the lines. At night, this was particularly difficult as flashlights couldn't be used, nor vehicles. 2 men would go out and find the identification tag on the line. With a field phone, they would tap into it and turn a handle, which would make the telephone at each end ring. If they could only reach one end, that meant there was a break the other way. Crossroads often had many lines going in all directions, so crossroads would be shelled frequently to hit vehicles and to break wires. As both German and Allied lines were along the same roads, sometimes they tapped into a German line. If someone answered in German, they would disconnect rapidly so the Germans couldn't pinpoint their position. There wasn't too much risk in that, as the Germans wouldn't waste shells trying to hit one man in the middle of nowhere. The German lines were left in place as they were only connected at one end, as the Germans were retreating, and the wires could be reused. When tapping into lines, the signalmen could get a shock, as they didn't usually have rubber gloves. When someone cranked the phone, that would send a surge along the line. It wasn't a dangerous shock, but it was uncomfortable and would stop any further work on that line. So 156,000 men landed in Normandy on the 6th of June 44, 135,000 men on the beaches, and 20,000 came in by air. Now the 13,000 American airborne, there was the 101st and the 82nd divisions. They were part of the 7th Corps, which was made up of the 4th Division, the 101st Division and the 82nd. Now the 4th Division were to get onto the beach, the 101st were to open the way for them to get off the beach, and the 82nd were to take some Merry Glees and some British over the Mer de Ray, so that they could get across the peninsula before taking Cherbourg. Now, Theodore Roosevelt was the deputy commander of the 4th Division under General Barton. Now, Roosevelt wanted to lead the men in the attack onto the Utah Beach. Of course, Barton was against that, because generals don't lead attacks. But Theodore Roosevelt insisted and said that when the men were on the beach, important decisions would need to be taken, and somebody should be there with the authority to take them. So finally Barton allowed him to go in. They thought he'd never see him again. Now, due to the current, the northwest wind, the DD tanks coming in, and the pilot boats being out of action, they ended up over a mile south of where they should have been. But that was a lucky accident, because they were actually in a better place than where they should have been. Now, Larry Saupetit was the orderly and the signalman and the driver for Roosevelt. Now, as soon as they landed, Roosevelt knew they were in the wrong place due to this red roof chalet here. It was marked on the map they had. It was just north of WN5. They were supposed to be between WN8 and WN9. Also, they were looking for a windmill that should have been near them, and what they called a mud fort, which is actually a redoute built by the French to protect France against the English as they were always fighting. Now, Roosevelt wanted to send a message to the fleet because he didn't want the Germans to know they were in the wrong place, and so the first coded message sent by Comanches was Larry Saupetit sending the message from Roosevelt to say they're in the wrong place. So he actually said, Saku Nunaway, Atatu Nunaway. That meant we've made a good landing. We landed in the wrong place. It was reported that Roosevelt then said, well, the war starts here. Now, Ambrose says that it was Colonel Van Fleet who said that. But Larry Saupetit, who was there, he says Roosevelt said it. So you can take your pick. Anyway, they've brought the rest of the men in here. Now, the bombing had been very effective here, and the place had been practically annihilated by the B-26s. Bombed it from 1,800 feet. There was still fire coming from the strong point, and there were shells coming in from Breakout Manor and other gun batteries inland, and shells coming from Maisie over there, where there were 6-inch guns firing on the day. Now, Roosevelt, he led the men over the sea wall, over the tank wall, and get them inland. Then he had to go to different groups to tell them that the plan has changed, because this change of plan was awkward, especially for the engineers who were supposed to control the beach. They were all set up to control the beach a mile up there. But when Roosevelt said, well, we're landing here, everybody's going to come in here, they had to change their plans. Some units landed further north, which is that way, and another Comanche code talker sent out a message in English saying, we've landed off course, we need help. Not many messages were sent in code on D-Day because the Germans could see where they were, and the men just had to get inland. Many of the men still thought this was a training exercise. They had so many training exercises that they didn't know this was the real thing. And it wasn't until they saw German prisoners, for many of them, that actually believed it. Even amongst the signalsmen, there's a group of signalsmen. They were supposed to put a line up a tree. Because there was explosions going on around them, nobody wanted to go up the tree. But Larry Saupetit, we thought even though the explosions were near, he would go up. When he was up the tree, he saw one GI taking German prisoners towards the beach. And he shouted down to the others, this is the real thing. It's on. The signalman's main job was to lay wires for the telephones if there were shells coming in. they couldn't advance, so the laying of wires would be held up until the enemy were pushed back. By the night of the 6th, the signalsmen were ready to go to sleep. They laid down in a field surrounded by hedges, and then the shells started coming in. So they had to get up quick, get their shovels out and start digging. As the troops moved inland, wire was running low, so Red Elk and 3 others went back in a truck during the night to recover wire. Now on the way back to the camp, the truck was going on very bumpy ground, and the Red Elk thought this must have been bombed pretty heavily for this road to be so bumpy. The next morning they went back out again to carry on retrieving wire, and they realised that they'd been driving over dead animals and dead German soldiers. That's what made the road bumpy. Roderick, Red Elk and some others were looking for a German foxhole to spend the night. They were walking across the field, the shells started coming in, so Roderick, he ran and dived into a trench. And while the shelling carried on, he laid his rifle across his chest and he went to sleep. He was woken up by the birds chirruping in the morning, and he opened his eyes. He saw there was a German at the end of the trench looking at him. But he pointed his rifle at him. The German didn't move. So he approached. He realised he was dead. So he closed his eyes and took his rifle off him. Now once established inland, the next objective was to get Cherbourg. Now Cherbourg's just 25 miles down there. It's supposed to be taken in 10 days. It actually took 3 weeks to take it, along with the 9th Division and the 79th Division. Von Schlieben finally surrendered on the 27th of June. Now once Cherbourg was taken, the next objective was Saint-Lô. Saint-Lô was taken on the 18th of July. Bradley now wanted to put Operation Cobra into action. This would drop 5,000 tons of bombs on the Germans to break their resistance. Charles Chibity and Haddon Codinha remember pulling back to dig deep foxholes before the bombing. The disorganised bombing caused 600 American deaths, including General McNair and a journalist, Bede Irvin. But the plan worked and the troops started pushing forward. The 4th Division advanced the most on the 25th of July. Patton had come into France on the 6th of July. After Cobra, he was advancing into Brittany and then eastwards. Roderick Red Elk and Melvin Permansu were assigned to the lead regiment with Patton. This was now the first time that Red Elk could use the Comanche code. Red Elk and Permansu were sending back messages to report their position. After a week, they were receiving messages telling them to stop. Patton said to ignore the messages. A few days later, the unit stopped to rest. That evening, they were surprised to hear a tank start up and start moving. A German tank had stealthily penetrated their positions and had run over 2 jeeps. Other tanks couldn't fire at it without hitting American soldiers. An officer organised his men to be ready with bazookas as it approached and only fire when it passed by them. 2 bazookas made direct hits and the tank exploded. They were often 40 miles in front of the front line. By the end of August, they were out of reach of supplies. The signalsmen didn't have time to lay wires. The 4th Division helped take Paris. It was liberated on the 25th of August. Forrest Casanavoid was with the 12th Regiment and they went into Paris and he said it was one big party. The others, with the 8th and the 22nd, had to go round the outskirts. From Paris, the 4th Division headed northeast towards Germany. During the rapid movements in August, radio had been the main means of communication. With the troops being held up at the German border, a whole network of wires had been installed. In August, the Germans had been pulling back out of France. Now they were back in Germany. They were fighting for the homeland and put up stiff resistance. One day near the Siegfried line, mortars started falling near Charles Chibity and other men. They took cover in near my house. Charles saw that Private Mullins was still sat on the log where they'd been. He called, but he didn't answer. He ran out and carried him back to the house. Mullins took 2 deep breaths, then died. A piece of shrapnel had gone right through his heart. On March the 17th, near the Siegfried line, Choctaw code talker Lieutenant Schilt Billy and his platoon were held up by a group of pillboxes. They'd lost over 30 men. Billy took 3 men and crawled towards a pillbox. They succeeded in killing 4 Germans and entered the bunker. Their action was seen by other Germans, and the pillbox came under heavy fire. They couldn't move forward or back. Billy reported to Major Treadwell, "I'm in this pillbox and I can't get out, can't get the rest of my platoon up." Treadwell realised that Billy had opened the door to the Siegfried line. He concentrated their efforts on this pillbox and finally reached it. The bunker was well stocked with rations and had bunks. Throughout the night and the next day, efforts to capture the next bunker failed. Billy was wounded and evacuated on the night of the 17th. The next morning, Treadwell raced across 800 yards to the next pillbox and managed to dive into a trench near it. He was surprised to find the door open, so threw a grenade into it. All the Germans but 2 in that first room were killed, and the other 2 surrendered. There were other Germans in other rooms, safe behind steel doors, but thinking that the position had been overrun, they surrendered. Treadwell repeated this action on the next pillbox, and in 10 minutes had captured 6 more pillboxes. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. They were in the Hurtgen forest for weeks. The Germans used airburst shells that would shower shrapnel down on the men. They had to dig side shelters into their foxholes. The shelling would break phone lines. Red Elk was out looking for a break when he tapped into a German line without realising. He was just about to talk in Comanche when a German said, "Was ist los?" "What's wrong?" Red Elk had picked up some German. He replied with a few choice insults and then took the clips off the line. He found the line to repair, then called both ends to tell them it was working again. The front line then called back a few minutes later. He said, "There's a tank going your way. The driver was firing at random. Must be crazy." Red Elk was still wrapping the wires when he heard shells coming through the trees. They weren't explosive shells, but armour-piercing, just ripping through the trees. One day near Luxembourg, Red Elk and another soldier were in the woods and saw a deer. They both fired and hit it. They strung it up to drain, then went back to the camp. They asked the mess sergeant if he knew how to cook deer. He said, "If you can get me one, I can cook it." So they asked for a truck. He supplied a 3/4-ton truck, and they went back to fetch it. When they got back to the camp, the company commander was there. They thought they were going to be in trouble, but they were welcomed and ate with the officers. The commander asked if they could get more. So next day they went out with 10 men, a 3/4-ton truck and a jeep with a machine gun on it. Red Elk said to the men, "Go over there and then come this way shouting. When I start firing, hit the deck." They soon had 6 deer. The company had deer steaks for 3 days. No code talkers were killed or captured during the war. Several were awarded Purple Heart for being wounded. Robert Holder, Forrest Casanavoid, Perry Noyabad, Larry Sorpity, and Willie Yashaki. While laying wire in the Hurtgen forest, Charles Chipperty and Willie Yashaki were pinned down by mortar fire. Yakeshi was raked across the back with shrapnel. He was loaded into a truck to be taken to the rear. As it slowed down to cross a shallow ditch, he jumped off and went back to the other Comanches. He was kept mostly in the aid station, doing odd jobs. Not long after D-Day, Larry Sorpity was wounded by 2 different shells. An 88 shell hit the trees above his foxhole. He was hit by splinters from the branches. Then an airburst shell pierced his lung, head and arm. He was flown to an English hospital for a long recovery. He joined the 4th Division just before the war ended. Perry Noyabad and Forrest Casanavoid were both wounded in separate airburst bomb raids. When the war in Europe ended on the 8th of May, some of the 4th Division were at Bad Tolz, south of Munich, not far from the Austrian border. The 4th Signal Company had laid 15,000 miles of wire. Now, the 4th Division had been in contact with the enemy for 299 days out of the 335 days in Europe. When Native American soldiers returned home, they were often greeted at the station by many tribespeople. Dances would be held on the spot. Forrest Casanavoid had brought back a Nazi flag he found near Cherbourg. His father laid it on the sidewalk and his relatives danced on it. At the time, Indians were forbidden to drink alcohol on or off the reservation. Many returning soldiers joined veterans clubs so they could drink a cold beer without being arrested. The government decided not to publicise the activities of the Code Talkers as they thought they might be needed again. Navajo Code Talkers were used in Korea and in Vietnam. It wasn't until 1969 that the information was declassified. In 1989, the French government and the state of Oklahoma honoured the Code Talkers at a ceremony in Oklahoma City. The Comanche flag was carried by Chapiti, Casanavoid and Red Elk. In 2019, at the 75th anniversary, the Comanche Code Talkers were honoured at a ceremony at Utah Beach. Charles Shea, the Penobscot medic of Omaha Beach, was there with some other Comanche tribespeople.